Welcome back to the Reimaginers, a series where we turn to the past to explore how education has previously been reimagined, by whom, and for what purposes. For our final episode, we travel to the Mississippi Delta to learn about the origin and promises of Head Start. As we'll learn today, the establishment of the program challenged traditional notions of early childhood education and transformed it into a vehicle of liberation. At a time when we have a real opportunity to reimagine education, it's helpful to return to this history as a springboard for a brighter future. I'm delighted to be co-hosting with Amber Joseph again today. Thanks for being here, Amber.
Thank you.
Today we have the privilege of learning from Dr. Crystal Sanders. Dr. Sanders is an associate professor of history and African American studies at Penn State University. Her scholarly work pushes us to move beyond the two-dimensional story of oppression and submission during the Jim Crow era of segregation to explore African Americans' everyday acts of resistance and resiliency throughout the 20th century to secure the rights and privileges of American citizenship. Her first book, A Chance for Change, Head Start in Mississippi's Black Freedom Struggle, considers how the Child Development Group of Mississippi, against massive opposition, moved early childhood education beyond teaching shapes and colors to challenge the state's closed political system and white supremacist ideology. Currently, Dr. Sanders is working on a book that explores the barriers Black Southerners faced in securing graduate education in the age of Jim Crow. Dr. Sanders, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, for our viewers, Dr. Sanders, can you briefly describe the climate in Mississippi during this time, including just an overview of how white Mississippians used violence to sustain segregation? How did this shape and or limit educational opportunities for Black Mississippians?
Sure, what a great question to begin with. I write about Mississippi during the Civil Rights era, really the 1950s, 1960s. And I can tell you during that period, Mississippi was a place with state-sanctioned repression and state-sanctioned terrorism and anti-Blackness. Oftentimes, law enforcement in that state collaborated with white supremacists to intimidate, to dominate, and to kill African American civil rights activists and their family members and their white allies. So, if we think about something like the death of Emmett Till in August of 1955, that's seen as a turning point in the movement. That's seen as kind of a rallying event for what would be considered the Emmett Till generation, these SNCC activists who come of age in the late 1950s, become civil rights activists in 1960. However, there were plenty of deaths in Mississippi that went unnoticed before 1955 and after 1955. So it was a common thing to find Black bodies in the Mississippi River. It's a common thing to hear of Black churches being bombed, to hear of night riders terrorizing African American families by shooting into their homes in the middle of the night, by screaming epithets as they go down past their homes, making their phones ring off the hook with harassing phone calls. This was really a way of life that Black Mississippians endured, and it's against these types of racial slights, these types of civil rights violations that African Americans are going to mobilize and fight against throughout the 1960s. But even earlier, they were doing this in the 1950s. And with education in particular, we must remember that going back to slavery, education has been a vehicle for freedom for African Americans, right? Knowing how to read and write helped enslaved people to run away when they could read a map, when they could read a newspaper, when they could actually read a sign to know where they were located at geographically. We know that immediately after the Civil War, the first thing that freed people do is to create universal public education in the South. African American legislators who are sitting in these state houses want to ensure that never again will African Americans be denied literacy, right? Denied the ability to learn to read and write. And so these schools that are created all across the South are really the creation of freedmen. You know, Du Bois tells us that in Black Reconstruction. He really wants us to remember that education was central to freedom for African Americans. And what we see by the end of Reconstruction is that white supremacists are hell-bent on trying to roll back these advances in education. They're trying to roll back the efforts of freedmen to really secure their freedom through literacy. And we see this by the underfunding of Black schools. So immediately after Reconstruction, looking at, at 1878, 1879, we begin to see that funding for Black schools is being siphoned off, and that funding that should have gone to Black schools is being reallocated to white schools. We're beginning to see that African Americans in states like Mississippi have shorter academic terms. And those terms are shorter so that Black children can pick cotton, so that they are available during harvest seasons, so that they are available when it's time to cure tobacco. So we already see that there are ways in which the white power structure is weakening the educational opportunities for Black Mississippians. We know that as late as 1945, there are parts of Mississippi with no public high schools for African Americans. This means that after the 8th grade, there is no other educational opportunity available for Black Mississippians. That's a shame. That's an indictment, right? The idea that white students have the opportunity to complete a high school education in that state, but Black students were not given that same opportunity. We know that as we're beginning to see the consolidation of public schools and these shiny 3-story brick buildings for white students, you still have Black students in those counties learning in one-room shacks with very poor ventilation, no type of heating, no running water, right? These are the realities that African American parents are finding themselves up against, throughout well into the 20th century. And as the NAACP begins their campaign to expose, right, these educational disparities, that is only when white Mississippians began to decide that they want to improve the educational opportunities for Black Mississippians. And so we began to see this rapid effort to try to equalize, right? And I use that in quotation marks, equalize public education in the Magnolia State. But for one thing, Mississippi doesn't have the resources to truly have a separate but equal public school system. And Black schools have been so underfunded, so neglected for generations that there's not enough money in the world to catch them up. So we know that separate but equal could never be a reality in the state of Mississippi. And indeed, it never was. Even to this day, we know that we have a unitary school system. We still know that Black students in Mississippi's public schools are not getting the same education as their white counterparts. But going back to the civil rights era, because of this rampant inequality, we see when Freedom Summer happens in Mississippi, SNCC activists in particular say we can't just focus on voting. We've got to do something to correct, right, the poor educational opportunities that Black Mississippians are being offered. So we see that SNCC workers create something called freedom schools. And in 1964, that 1964 summer, these freedom schools existed across the state, especially in the Delta, especially in, the Hill Country, especially in the Gulf region of the state. What we see is that these makeshift schools are set up, and students of all ages, students who are preschoolers, students who are grandparents, are flocking to these schools in an effort to receive an education that's void of notions of Black inferiority. They are to receive an education that introduces them to concepts like democracy and citizenship, things that are left out of the regular public school system as a way of trying to ensure that African Americans are not cognizant of their rights as citizens, right? Mississippi's the state that in the 1940s decides that they're not gonna allow textbooks in Black schools that use the words democracy and voting. That was an effort to really prevent Black Mississippians from knowing that according to the United States Constitution, they have the right to vote. Knowing that the United States is a democracy, right, where people of a certain age are supposed to be able to take part, right, in the electoral process. They are to be able to take part in deciding who's going to govern them. But in an effort to make African Americans ignorant, right, of those rights, Mississippi officials go so far as to say we got to have a certain type of textbook that we use in Black schools. After Brown, we see Mississippi does away with compulsory education. So no longer is it a law that you have to go to school between the ages of 6 and I think it was 6 and maybe 16 at the time. I forget the actual ages, but the fact that they do away with compulsory education in an effort to preserve segregation, in an effort to supposedly prevent Black students from learning in the same classrooms with white students. This is the environment, right, in which CDGM, the Head Start program that I write about, came to life, right? It exists against this backdrop, against this long history of white resistance to Black education.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, really setting that context for us, because I think it's so important to understand that this is the climate in which Head Start comes into being. So can you describe a little bit about what Head Start, what it was, what its goals were, its ambitions?
Sure. You know, many people forget that Head Start was a part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, and the War on Poverty being a part of the Great Society. So when we think of the Great Society, we think of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Some people think of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, right? But this War on Poverty comes out of the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. And really in 1964, President Johnson waged a war on poverty. He has essentially said the United States had the resources to raise all Americans out of poverty. And so this war on poverty was going to be the effort to do it. It was going to be a federal campaign to improve the living conditions of all Americans, whether they lived in California or whether they lived in New York or whether they lived in rural Mississippi. And so the Economic Opportunity Act had several components, right? There were several different titles within the act to really focus on different populations within the United States. So there were resources for farmers, there were resources for college students, work study, right? Comes out of the Economic Opportunity Act and this war on poverty. But after the war on poverty had been, really implemented, the first 6 months, Sergeant Schreiber, who had been tasked with kind of leading this war on poverty effort, realized that 50% of Americans living in poverty in the United States were under the age of 5. And none of the anti-poverty programs that had been implemented actually addressed this particular demographic. So he says, we've got to do something. We're trying to improve the lives of all Americans, but none of our programs, we've got programs for the elderly, programs for farmers, programs for college students, but we have nothing for small children. And 50% of those living in poverty in this nation are small children. And so a group of educators, lawyers, social workers, it came together and they really created this project called Project Head Start. And essentially the idea was to prepare youngsters for the first grade with the idea that if youngsters got a firm foundation, right? If they got a firm foundation to be ready for the first grade, then there was less of a chance that they would fall behind academically and drop out, with the understanding that people who drop out of school have a higher probability of ending up in poverty, right? Because they don't have the educational credentials to be able to secure a job. Now, notice I said the first grade. I didn't say kindergarten. And that's because in 1965, when Head Start is created, only 16 states have public kindergartens. So in many areas, you didn't start any type of formal education until the first grade. And imagine in some states, you have first graders whose parents could afford to send them to a private kindergarten. So they had actually gone to school before they started the public schools. But then you had children from low income families whose parents could not afford to send them to a private kindergarten. So their really first opportunity with structured instruction came in the first grade. And oftentimes those students were already behind and they never had the opportunity to catch up. So Head Start was to meet that gap. Head Start was to ensure that whether you were the child of one of the Rockefellers or whether you were the child of a sharecropper, you had the opportunity to have early childhood instruction before you start the first grade. It was the idea that you're going to learn how to go to a classroom, learn in a classroom, learn with other people. This idea of those social skills, right, that kids need. It was also, however, not just going to address preparing them academically. So in addition to learning their ABCs and their numbers and their colors and their shapes, this program was to ensure that they were physically ready for school. Because oftentimes in a place like Mississippi, kids whose parents were sharecroppers, who were coming off of plantations to go to the first grade, started school with all types of ailments, curable ailments. Some of them simply needed a pair of eyeglasses, but their parents never had the ability to get their eyes checked. Some of them had hearing loss and simply needed to have that hearing loss addressed, but teachers wrote them off as mute and did not even try to work with them, right? So the idea was, we're gonna not just address their academic needs, we're gonna address their physical needs. We're gonna ensure that they have everything they need to be successful by the time they enter the first grade. If it's glasses they need, we're gonna make sure that they get it. If they are anemic, we're gonna make sure they get the iron supplements they need. Whatever it was that these young people needed to be healthy, right? To have a healthy start to school, Head Start was gonna provide that. So Head Start provided academic preparation, it provided physical and psychological treatments and exams for students. It also introduced these kids to nutritious meals, where many of them are coming off of poor plantations where they didn't have balanced diets. They had very starchy diets that are high in starches, that are low in fruits and vegetables, low in protein. The idea was, we are gonna ensure that these kids have access to nutritious meals. But here's the kicker. Here's the thing that I think is very important about Head Start. And that is that Head Start's architects understood that the only way to improve the life outcomes for children is to also help their families. It means nothing to take a child and feed that child every day from breakfast and lunch if that child is going home to a house with no food. If that child is going home to a house where the parents don't have jobs. If that child is going home to a house that is barren, that has poor ventilation, that has no heat, no running water, no anything, because the parents are unemployed, right? All of that sets the child up for failure. So Head Start had this notion that the only way you can help kids is to help their families. The only way you can help kids is to ensure that the communities in which these kids are being raised have the resources they need to ensure that these kids are properly stimulated, right? That the communities in which they are living in are not working against the very efforts that are taking place within Head Start centers. So I mention that because Head Start's architects were very keen on saying, this is not a kindergarten. If anything, this is a communigarden. We are preparing these kids for school, but we are also improving the communities in which these children live. And Head Start does that by a number of ways. But most importantly, what Head Start did is that it created jobs for the women and men in these communities. And these were women and men who often didn't have that much education. Remember, in a place like Mississippi, high schools for African Americans didn't even exist in certain parts of the state. So there are people who have an 8th grade education, but who desire to work with children, right? Who have perhaps kept white children for many years. So they have some experience working with kids. And also, these are people who want to make an income, who want to make a living to support their own families. And so Head Start reaches out to these communities by saying, we are going to employ you in Head Start centers. We're going to give you the opportunity to become an educator. If you have an 8th grade education, if you have a love of children, if you're willing to go through a short but rigorous training process, we will hire you. We will pay you a livable wage. We're going to pay you enough money that you're going to be able to provide for your family. And at the same time, you're going to have the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of children. In a place like Mississippi, this is big news, especially for Black women who have been forced off of plantations as sharecroppers as mechanization has come to the state. And white farmers are replacing Black field hands with machines, right? So this is an opportunity for them to not only get a living wage, to not only have a job again, but the opportunity in many cases to work with their own children, to have the opportunity to assume the title of educator, a very revered position in Black communities, right? And to have the opportunity to work outside of the local white power structure. Because at this point, Head Start is a federal program. That means these people working in Head Start are federal employees. They are not employed by Miss Sally or Mr. John down the street, which gives them a little bit more freedom to be politically active. If we recall, in 1961, Fannie Lou Hamer is fired from her job, evicted from the plantation where she worked, all because she attempted to register to vote. She was not successful in registering, but just the fact that she went down to the courthouse and attempted to register resulted in her losing her job being kicked off of the plantation. It resulted in her husband losing his job and also being kicked off the plantation. This was something that was commonly done to African Americans. But now, if they become Head Start employees, they don't have to worry about losing their job for something as simple as trying to exercise their constitutional right to vote. So Head Start was important for young people, and it's important for older members of the communities in which these young people lived.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think you painted a very wide and far-reaching picture of what Head Start was aiming to do, which I think is really important for our next question, because what's really interesting in your work is the divide over Head Start. So, you paint this picture that Head Start sounds like it's really fulfilling a need, but there's actually complicated feelings about Head Start. It's clear from the context you've described the level of white resistance of the program, but you also describe resistance from SNCC and others. Can you say more about what those tensions are?
Sure. And first, I should say, when we talk about SNCC, we're referring to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC was an organization that grew out of the student sit-in movement that began February 1, 1960 in Greensboro, when 4 North Carolina A&T students sat down at a Woolworth's counter. But it's important to remember that SNCC had been working in Mississippi since about 1961. So these college students, these young activists, had really gotten to know the local people well. They lived together, they ate together, they went to the same churches, they got beat up together, they got arrested together. So these young people had really gotten to know Black Mississippians very, very well. And they had worked together in 1964 on Freedom Summer. They had worked together in forming the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was an interracial political party challenging the all-white Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi. And you might recall at the end of 1964, the MFDP, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, took their challenge to Atlantic City, to the Democratic National Convention, or they were asking the Democratic Party to unseat or not recognize that all-white delegation from the state of Mississippi, and rather to recognize the interracial, democratically elected Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And if you remember your history lessons, you'll remember that President Lyndon Johnson, behind the scenes, orchestrates that the MFDP would not be recognized, right? He wants a crowning achievement. He does not want to alienate white voters in Mississippi and across the South. So he works out a deal where the MFDP would be offered 2 seats, really 2 seats that are really honorific as a way to acknowledge the MFDP, but it was going to allow the all-white delegation to still be the only delegation represented from the state of Mississippi. And that is a turning point for the Mississippi movement, because all summer, right, these SNCC activists and these local Black Mississippians have been working to prove just how widespread disfranchisement was in that state. In that 1964 summer, there are the 3 civil rights workers who were murdered. We know that at the convention, there are signs being held up showing pictures of those 3 civil rights workers. We know that Fannie Lou Hamer gives a very memorable, right, testimony where she talks about everything that they've endured. And yet, despite all of that, the Democratic Party basically says, we'll make sure in the future that we don't have segregated districts or segregated delegations at our conventions. Remember, they say from 1968 onward, we promise to do better. But in 1964, we're not going to make these waves. We're going to give you guys 2 seats. And they even said which 2 delegates would sit in those 2 seats. And that was really, that was not just a disappointment, that was a moment of anger for many SNCC activists who had been working in the state, many SNCC activists who had campaigned for Lyndon Johnson, many SNCC activists who had put their bodies on the line to really dramatize how necessary a Civil Rights Act was. So in 1965, when this Head Start program comes out of the Johnson administration, there are many SNCC activists who say, I don't know if we can trust the federal government. Perhaps this is an effort to co-opt our movement. We had successful freedom summers, or freedom schools during Freedom Summer. These schools have been run voluntarily. Perhaps that's the route we need to go. Why all of a sudden is the federal government interested in giving us resources, throwing money into our communities? Are they trying to buy us off? Are they trying to kind of kill off the momentum that we've had? Are they trying to make us forget the way in which we were done wrong in Atlantic City. So it was because of these things that many SNCC activists said, I'm just not comfortable partnering with this federal government. This is the same federal government that has not been able to provide us protection as we go into the South to organize. This is the same federal government whose Justice Department appears to sometimes be in cahoots with the very people who are knocking us in the head. We're not so certain that this is an opportunity that we think we need to pursue. So while SNCC activists, were really hesitant, were really many opposed to this program, local people on the ground saw things a little differently. They saw that they didn't have many options for employment. They saw that Mississippi's public schools continued to be desegregated, or continued to be segregated at this point, 11 years after the Brown decision, right? And so they said, this is an opportunity to perhaps give our children the types of educational opportunities that we've always wanted them to have. This money is not going to be filtered through white school boards. This money is not going to be filtered through our segregationist governor. The federal government is willing to put money directly in our hands. We will have the opportunity to decide what type of curriculum our children get. We will have the opportunity to decide who's going to teach them. We will not put the same types of constraints on our teachers that are put on the Black teachers in the public school system. We won't tell our teachers that they can't be a member of the NAACP. We won't tell our teachers that they can't vote. We're not going to tell our students that their only jobs that they're good for are working in the field or cleaning a white woman's home. So for Black Mississippians, they saw this opportunity very differently than many SNCC activists. So I take this as a moment to say, yeah, this was a breaking of sorts, right? Where local people went in a different direction from some of the people they had been organizing with for years. But I think it speaks also to the power that these communities have, that they feel that they're emboldened enough to be able to stand up to their co-collaborators and say, no, we're going to go a different way on this issue, right? And indeed they do. Now, after CDGM begins, there's going to be more intraracial confrontations as working class Black Mississippians find that middle class Black Mississippians are not happy with having to share power, having to share authority, having to share resources, right? Working class Black Mississippians with 8th grade educations were suddenly allocating $1 million federal grants. They suddenly have the decision-making power to decide who to hire, who to fire. They are the ones signing contracts with vendors from everything from milk to paper to crayons to markers. And this gives them, a level of authority they had never had before. Perhaps they might have been a deacon in their church or a missionary in their church, but all of a sudden they've got they're wielding power and they've got some clout, right? And for middle-class African Americans in Mississippi who all of a sudden are now having to share power with working-class Black Mississippians, and they're also no longer able to kind of be the conduit through which working-class Black Mississippians are getting their demands, sent up for those in the federal government to hear about. This becomes a turf war, and it becomes of who's in charge and who's been put in charge and why. And so as I show in the book, there appears to be some tension between, state NAACP leaders and CDGM operatives on the ground, with many NAACP leaders making the case that they are not hired, that CDGM officials are not giving them the opportunity to work in CDGM. Now, that is true. But oftentimes, the way CDGM centers operated was that it said jobs were first going to go to those who had been working in the community, through SNCC projects and other efforts that had been going on in the 1960s. And so this meant someone like Fannie Lou Hamer or someone like Unita Blackwell would be hired before a public school teacher who wanted to work in the program would be hired. And oftentimes, in that public school teacher's defense, when they were working for the state, they really could not overtly participate in civil rights. Whether they were doing so covertly or not, I don't know. But overtly, they weren't able to. And this seemed to be a liability when it came to getting a CDGM job when CDGM operates.
Thank you for that. And you've already kind of mentioned a couple of times who the teachers were in Head Start. And they bring this different knowledge that's maybe not from a credentialed teaching program or something like that, but it actually turns out to be something quite transformative in the schools. Can you talk about what were some of the things that they did to really turn this program into, as you say in your book, a vehicle for liberation?
And first, let me say, I'm not just saying CDGM picked anyone off the street and said, you teach, you teach, you teach. No, not at all. Women who expressed an interest in becoming a CDGM teacher went through very rigorous training exercises. There was a training workshop, right, that was about 2 weeks long that took place before Head Start opened in that first initial summer of July of 1965. But then throughout the summer and really throughout subsequent years, these teachers are being sent all across the country to receive additional training. The Bank Street School, Peabody, these are some of the most well-respected educational centers in the country are receiving these women from Mississippi to kind of equip them with the skills and know-how of classroom management, of the best pedagogical techniques. So they're not just some willy-nilly person off the street that's now been labeled a teacher, but they did receive training, consistent training, right? Ongoing training throughout their tenure with Head Start. And I'll say that what makes this program unique is that the teachers had a say in the curriculum that they wanted to offer their students. And in Mississippi, because Black students had been denied knowledge of Black history for so long, CDGM teachers were adamant that that was going to be the center of their curriculum. They wanted Black students to learn about Crispus Attucks. They wanted Black students to learn about the Haitian Revolution. They wanted Black students to learn about all of the ways in which African Americans had contributed to the fabric of the United States, right? They wanted Black students to learn West African history. They didn't want Africa to be seen as this backwards place of savages, but they wanted these students to know that Africa was a cultural beacon, right? That it had various languages, that it had tons of different religions, tons of different languages, that it was a place to be proud of, not a place to be ashamed of, right? And so the teachers are very intentional with their curriculum. They use opportunities to teach everything from, they have the students to vote on what color crayons they use. They ensure that the students don't just celebrate traditional holidays like 4th of July or George Washington's birthday, but they wanted students to celebrate the anniversary of Nat Turner's rebellion. They wanted students to celebrate the anniversary of the beginning of the Haitian Revolution. They wanted students to commemorate Medgar Evers' assassination day, to remind them that Black Mississippians had been organizing, that Black Mississippians had not sat down and taken white supremacy lightly, but that they had resisted in every way that was possible given the circumstances. So these teachers are really trying to create a curriculum that prepares Black students to go into the public schools, because when these students go into the public schools, they want them to go in being proud of who they are. They want them to go in knowing that African Americans have a history, that African Americans have a past, that African Americans have a culture. They wanted these students to be assertive. They wanted these students to be confident. They wanted them to be proud. They wanted these students to know that you can ask questions, that you don't have to accept everything at face value, that you have the right to voice your opinion. And so all of their classroom activities were designed to really facilitate this type of assertion in their students, to really prepare them to be confident, to prepare them to be bold, to prepare them to be courageous students in the classroom, and then hopefully courageous and productive citizens once they became adults.
Yeah, there's a lot there that I'm just thinking about as I'm listening to you, because as we talk about Head Start and its transformative possibilities, I can't help but think about our present. And as you mentioned, Head Start is one of the programs from the Great Society that still exists today. So I'm curious, what do you think enabled Head Start to endure for so long, especially given the initial opposition that you laid out in such a detailed way? And then my second question is how might its endurance and pedagogical vision of the teachers that you just spoke about, help us think about educational policy and teaching in the present?
Okay, well, first I'll say, Head Start has faced many battles. Going back to the late 1960s, there have been those who've questioned the efficacy and the necessity of Head Start, right? Does it make a difference? Do Head Start alumni have gains that last with them throughout their educational careers? And, we can find studies that say both things, studies that say it makes a world of difference, and then studies that say it doesn't make that much difference. One of the things that I think is key, however, in that Head Start has been able to secure broad support from both sides of the aisle for several generations now, because the program has done a good job of being intentional about supporting children and their families. And while there are many different early education models at this point, no program, I believe, does a better job of incorporating the family into the early educational experience of the child than Head Start. I think that is one of the reasons why it has lasted so long, because Head Start has created opportunities for young mothers in particular. And that fact is hard to deny, right? Even when we want to talk about the gains that last with children, we know the numerous stories of Head Start mothers who have become teachers, who've gone back to school, gotten associate degrees, gotten bachelor's degrees, are now working in Head Start programs or working in public school systems. And so that's one of the reasons why I think Head Start has endured for so many generations, despite all of the efforts to undercut it, all of the efforts to underfund it, all of the efforts to dissolve it. I also think that we're seeing, really in this pandemic, in this moment that we're in right now, I actually believe we're going to see, I hope we're going to see greater support for early childhood education initiatives, as we're seeing parents struggle to work from home and take care of small kids, right? As we're seeing the importance of making sure that kids can stay on track. And if we're worried about our kids staying on track when, we've got computers to give them, we've got desks for them to sit at, what about these children whose parents don't have those resources? How do we make sure that they're not sitting home all day unstimulated, right? And so I really believe that this is a moment where we're going to have some reckonings as a nation about how we're going to ensure that when we come out of this pandemic, young people in particular have the opportunities they need to be successful. That no matter if they're rich or poor, no matter if their parents work at home or outside of the home, that these children, wherever they live, whoever they are, have the resources they need to stay on schedule, to stay on grade level, to stay active, to keep their minds sharp, right? And so I'm really hoping that that's a conversation that's going to come out of, out of this really tragic and ongoing pandemic that we find ourselves in. Now, to the second part of your question, I think there were several things that Head Start can teach us for this moment and the future. And I think the first is learning is communal. I say learning is communal in that we just can't be concerned with what goes on in the schoolhouse from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock, right? But we need to be concerned about the communities in which these schools are located. We need to be concerned about the families that are represented by each student in the classroom. That means, we do need to go back to a model of ensuring that families have what they need to help their children be successful. And I was having a conversation with a class at Amherst College about 2 weeks ago, and it came up that, most of for young people, for school-age children, most of their social services come through schools, meaning, they get their, they get breakfast, if they qualify, they're getting breakfast and lunch through, federal school programs, school lunch programs. We know that oftentimes they're receiving psychological services, they're receiving counseling through their school systems. And we're now at a point where most kids right now are still at home. While there are efforts to ensure that those kids are still getting access to nutritious meals, everybody's not getting it. There are kids that are lost in the gap. And so this is a reminder that, again, we need to ensure that our educational system is communal, meaning whether the school is functioning or not, that kids have access to the things that they need. Head Start did a good job of doing that. CDGM in particular ensured that communities, right, even when those kids were not at the Head Start Center, at their Head Start centers, communities had the resources to ensure that those kids received nutritious meals, that they had the resources for their parents to have employment to provide for them. And so I say, I don't necessarily know how that can look on the ground, but I know that's a conversation we need to have, because we know right now there are kids that are not receiving the meals that they would normally get if they were going to school Monday through Friday. And for some kids, that's the difference between starvation and a full stomach. And so those are the types of issues that Head Start has done a great job of addressing. And it's something that I'm hoping is going to be on the agenda of policymakers as we dig our way out of this crisis. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it hopefully is a reminder that we need to be reimagine, right? What education encompasses and what education can do. And is education just for the student that's in K-12, or are we looking at some type of educational program that benefits that student and that student's family?
Thank you for that, Dr. Sanders. I think that, those are really insightful ways to use that history in the present that, I know I'm thinking about right now in really powerful ways. But I'm curious, Amber, right, you're currently teaching in New York City schools, and you're thinking about, what we've just talked about. You're also teaching in a pandemic where you were in school and then out of school, and there's this kind of lack of stability. I'm curious what you're thinking about in terms of reimagining education and how this conversation might change some of the ways that you're thinking about where we go forward.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Sanders. I think you touched on so many things, but all of those things are really important. I've been thinking a lot about some of the things that you mentioned about communal education, because I think, it's when schools shut down in New York City, I can speak from that perspective. There was a lot of conversation about keeping them open for as long as possible in the face of all the uncertainty that was happening in March. And one of the conversations that was repeated a lot in the media too was, if schools aren't open, kids are not going to have access to these things, right? And I know for a lot of educators, myself included, the question was, well, schools have been catch-alls for social services for so long that that's the system that we set up. We decided as a country that schools will do everything. And so now in this moment of global crisis where there's a pandemic and keeping schools open and having people in a space actually seems dangerous, to me, it just felt like another example of how shortchanged education has been for so many decades. Like, why is it that students rely on bagged lunches and breakfasts and hot lunch and breakfast? Like, why is it that school is the place where children can get eye exams? Like, why is it the place where children get social and mental services? So I think what you said is so important. And I'm hoping too, especially in this current election cycle, that we can emerge from it as a country where we are thinking about these things, where it's not just a building where kids go and whatever happens in that building is what happens in the building, and then the child comes home. So I'm with you on that too. The other thing that this is making me think about is just a reimagining of what school is for. I don't think I've ever heard so much conversation about social emotional learning since the pandemic happened. And I think that's great, because if these are places where children are spending so much time, it can't just be a place where they're just textbook learning and standardized testing and all the policy discussions we've had for the past 10 years, these like fights over reform. I think a lot of that has to go out the window, because now literally like we're fighting over what a school looks like physically. And I think if we're going to reimagine what we want, this is the time to do it. People talk about returning to normal after this, and I think that's the wrong question. Like, what does normal look like? Because normal wasn't working for lots of people for a very long time. And you see that, I think, baseline if you work in a school every day. And then the other thing I'm just thinking about is just where this all sits in our current climate around race relations. because, you know, so much of what you said at the beginning of our conversation about how the textbooks were designed in Mississippi is just, I'm just thinking about the conversations over the past week in the media about the fact that the GOP, many people campaigning, won't admit that the United States is a republic or a democracy. They won't use the term. And it's chilling because what? But also, I think you did a really nice job connecting it to, we've seen this before, in a state that sanctioned violence and repression. That state was Mississippi. Mississippi was not the only state that did that. But it wasn't recent in our history. And, you know, reading your work, it made me, Matt and I were talking about this before, it's just like what a horrifying place. What a horrifying place to live as a Black person, but also what a horrifying place to live as a white person who, you know, no opportunity to conceive of something better. So I think this is a time that's ripe for lots of reckoning, and the discussion around race relations and what kind of country we want to have is a huge one. Again, I would hate to go back to normal, because what was normal for lots of people was not working for other people. And so, yeah, it's a moment where so much is unclear and uncertain and terrifying that I kind of feel like we should just go all in and see it as an opportunity for a chance for change, like the title of your book, because something's going to have to give. The idea of digging out, like you said, like digging out of the crisis we're in, I think also needs to be at times like plant some seeds. Like, what do we want to see? Because this isn't working for lots of people.
Exactly.
So,
and while I completely agree, I think this is a time that we can really reimagine public education in the United States. The one thing I say, however, is that I do not want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And by that, I mean, I think that I'm a little nervous that there could be a push to go to online education for the majority of students, and that does not work well for students of color. I know in certain communities, and not just with students of color, but predominantly with students of color, they have poor access to the internet. They need face-to-face instruction. As I said when we started, public schools in the South are the creation of freedmen. Freedmen had wanted to ensure that whoever you were, rich or poor, Black or white, boy or girl, you had the opportunity to a decent, free education. We're seeing that under attack. It was under attack before the pandemic, but surely now, where people are trying to say you can get a K-12 education in front of a computer, when we know there are certain families that can't even afford computers, certain families that live in areas that don't have, constant internet access. We need to ensure that those students are not forgotten and those students are not left out. So certainly when it becomes safe to do so, I hope that that students that especially need it can go back to a school building and not be forced to learn in front of a computer.
Yeah.
Thank you both. My only regret from this conversation is that it wasn't our first episode, because Amber, I think you laid out the rationale for how we can use this time to really reimagine education. And Dr. Sanders, I think your last point there about not just all of a sudden assuming everything can be on the computer, but recognizing what students need, both in terms of, maybe what it's a literacy or numeracy instruction, but also recognition of who they are as individuals and how they can participate in democracy, I think is incredibly powerful. So thank you both so much for sharing your perspectives. For those of you who've been watching, this is the final episode, at least of this season, of the Reimaginers. For Amber Joseph, Crystal Sanders, and myself, Matt Kautz, thanks for watching.